Speculative realism, it's an adjective plus a noun, and as such, it's one among many options. I've listed here just some of the different kinds of realism that are out there today. The agential realism of Karen Barad, critical realism, very well known in the UK, of Roy Bhaskar, the internal realism of analytic philosopher Hilary Putnam, new realism in Italy and Germany, Maurizio Ferraris and Marcus Gabriel, the quasi-realism of Simon Blackburn, who I believe is speaking at this festival, and finally, naive realism, a kind of insult that anti-realists throw at realists, as if all forms of nihilism, as though all forms of realism were naive and should be shunned for that very reason. Speculative realism is also a phrase of this sort. One of the reasons this happens, that you get lots of descriptive phrases with realism in them, is that realism can mean so many different kinds of things. And so we have to specify exactly what speculative realism means. Now, I've put here a slide of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, his renegade students. This is presumably from sometime in the early 1920s. It's the best photo of the two together I could find. You can't see Husserl's face. You can think of Husserl and Heidegger as the two founding figures of what we call continental philosophy today. You could put it back further and include Hegel if you want, but in terms of contemporary continental philosophy, Husserl and Heidegger are two of the major canonical figures. One thing they both have in common is that they both didn't think very highly of the question of the external world. Does the external world exist outside the mind? Both of them tended to dismiss it as what they called a pseudo-problem. For Husserl, conscious life always amounts to what he calls intending some object. If I wish for something. If I judge, I'm judging something. If I speak, I'm speaking about something, some object, even if it's non-existent. I can hallucinate a centaur, but there's still a centaur there as the object of my hallucination. So as far as Husserl's concerned, consciousness is pointed at objects whether we like it or not. And so there's no point in wondering how we leap from outside of our mind into a world with objects. Heidegger's criticism of the realist question is similar. Heidegger thinks that humans are always already thrown into the world, and we are counting on and relying on practical devices. We are not primarily looking at the world. I'm primarily right now using the chair, using the atmospheric oxygen in the room to stay alive by breathing, using the smooth function of my bodily organs to stay alive, and so forth. So for both of them, we're always already involved with things, with the world, and therefore there's no point in coming up with complex epistemological maneuvers to try to prove that we can get out of the mind into an outer world. And so for this reason, realism was never taken all that seriously in the continental tradition, with the exception of Nikolai Harman, the German philosopher who's a rough contemporary of Heidegger, is experiencing a revival these days, but he was so marginalized compared to Husserl and Heidegger, who really set the tone. And so if you had written a dissertation in a continental philosophy department 25 years ago, or 20 years ago when I was doing it, on the existence of the external world, people would be smirking and chuckling behind your back because it wasn't considered a serious problem. This is the four of us at 2007 in Goldsmiths. So within this context, speculative realism tried to argue for realism within a continental context. It would have been not news at all in the analytic philosophy context, where realism has always been a very robust presence. But in the continental tradition, this was fairly controversial. And I think it's had an effect. You hear more people now offering realist interpretations of philosophers such as Derrida and Heidegger, who wouldn't have been associated with the word realism at all. And I think a lot of that is people responding to what the speculative realists did. I want to say a couple of other things about this slide before we get going. The first is that you see four white guys here. And this is an era when, in philosophy in particular, we're especially concerned with diversity and inclusion. So I sometimes am asked, why was it four white guys? Well, the simplest answer to that is that it was four people who loosely knew each other. Brassier knew on the right, knew Ian Hamilton Grant on the left. And there am I, second from the left. I knew Quentin Meillassoux somewhat from having met him in Paris. And so Ray Brassier and I simply each of us brought together one acquaintance we knew with similar philosophical interests, and we combined for this event. The other thing is, you have to remember this was not a very prestigious group at the time. All four of us were quite marginalized in our profession 13 years ago. Not very visible. We were starting to publish, but did not have especially prestigious academic positions or acclaim at that time. And so it was a meeting of the marginalized. And so if anyone else had wanted to join us at the time, of any background, we would have been more than delighted. So that's my answer to that question. Now, there's another question which has to do with the basis of this philosophical movement. Usually when you see a group of philosophers come together, there's some shared tradition or some shared inspiring figure who they're all working out of. So you see Heideggerians inspired by Heidegger, Deleuzians inspired by Deleuze, and so forth. What was interesting about this group is that we don't really have any shared philosophical heroes. There's no philosopher that all four of us were passionate about. In fact, in many cases, the other members strongly dislike the favorite philosopher of each of the four of us. The only shared influence among the four of us was the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. And we all had our own interpretations of Lovecraft. I've written a book about Lovecraft called Weird Realism. And now Lovecraft has experienced a pop culture resurgence. There's a popular television series. There's a board role-playing game. People are reading Lovecraft in greater numbers than before. Usually this happens to people in their teenage years. In my case, I didn't read Lovecraft till my late 30s, so I was a very late comer to the party. It'd be like reading Lord of the Rings for the first time in your late 30s. It's usually something that teenagers get excited about first. So let me go now briefly through each of these members and summarize what each of the spans of speculative realism work on, because each of the four philosophies are very different, even though we were all Lovecraft fans and we were all continental philosophers working in a largely anti-realist tradition, trying to make a vigorous case for realist philosophy. Ian Hamilton Grant, looking good there in Bristol at the University of West of England. One of the nicest people I know. Ian is inspired largely by the philosophies of Deleuze and F.W.J. Schelling from the German idealist times. And you could safely say that Ian is focused on nature as a process. Nature is a continuous process of becoming that generates individual objects only through what he calls retardations. There's this primal continuous force that for some reason gets obstructed here and there and gives rise to cats and bicycles and buildings and trees and what we normally think of as the major autonomous entities that populate our world. Ray Brassier, who has now in the American University of Beirut, he was at the time at Middlesex University in London before they closed their philosophy program in 2010, I believe it was. Ray Brassier is arguably the most pessimistic philosopher in the Western tradition since Schopenhauer and Edward von Harman. Brassier he stresses not only that the universe will become extinct someday, he says that since the universe will become extinct someday, you're already dead. You may think you're alive, but you're already dead. Nihilism, Nihil Unbound is the title of his book, and he thinks that science and science-based philosophy are speculative tools that enhance our incentives to be nihilists. That there is a gap between any scientific theory and reality, an irremediable gap. And therefore, what science is really doing is it's not trying to teach us positive truths about the world, because each of those scientific theories lasts only for a little while before it's shown to be inadequate. That scientific theories are there to show us the ultimate nullity of each of our theories about the cosmos. And it's a progressive process. We're becoming less and less attached to this world as we become acquainted with the nothingness of it. Quentin Meillassoux, who was then a tutor at the École Normale Supérieure, since then has been called to a professorship at the Sorbonne. Speculative realism made him a lot more visible. I've written an entire book on Meillassoux, whose philosophy fascinates me. Meillassoux is a realist in the sense that he starts with a conflict, or what he calls an aporia, between two different truths. On the one hand, he says that it's true that anything we say about the world is simply us saying it. Anything we say about the world is correlated with us. He calls this correlationism. There's this idea that if I say something about the world, it's my saying the thing about the world. It's not me standing in a vacuum initially stating true propositions about the world. I'm trapped in a correlate between myself and the world, and so a statement about the world is a statement about the world as given to me. I mention this because sometimes people view Meillassoux straightforwardly as a critic of correlationism. he actually is quite an admirer of correlationism. He thinks the correlationists have a good argument. If I try to speak about something outside of the mind, I'm speaking about it. So therefore, it's also inside the mind. I can't really escape that circle initially. Now, however,
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.